James Mitchell was the kind of guy neighbors referred to as the lucky one. At 32, he had already achieved a respectable position as a software engineer at a leading technology company in Austin, Texas. His modest house in a quiet suburb was meticulously maintained, the lawn always mowed, the driveway free of leaves. Colleagues appreciated his reliability. Friends admired his even-temperedness. But for 8 years he had carried a void within him that no professional success could fill. Priya had been the center of his world. They had met during his semester abroad in Bangalore, where he was studying computer science as an exchange student. Priya was working as a translator for an international consulting firm at the time. Their first encounter took place in a crowded cafe on Commercial Street, where she patiently helped him improve his broken Hindi, while he enriched her English with American idioms. What began as a language exchange quickly developed into something deeper. Priya was unlike any woman James had met before. She possessed a natural elegance, wore traditional kurtas with the same ease as Western clothing, and spoke 4 languages fluently. Her family came from a respectable middle-class background in Mumbai. Her father was an accountant and her mother was a teacher. They had traditional values but were open-minded enough to let their daughter live her own life. When James asked for Priya's hand in marriage, they welcomed him with typical South Asian hospitality. Even though cultural differences caused some tension at first, the wedding was held according to both American and Hindu traditions. In Austin, they exchanged vows before a registrar, followed by a traditional ceremony in Bangalore, complete with a mandap Agni ritual and several days of celebrations. James learned about the complex family structures that shaped South Asian life. Priya's uncle, Rajesh Sharma, was particularly present during the wedding preparations. As a successful businessman in the real estate sector, he had gained the trust of the family and often took on the role of head of the family in important decisions, as Priya's father was in poor health. After the wedding, they moved to Austin, where Priya took a job as a cultural consultant for a multinational company. She helped American companies expand their business in South Asia. Their apartment became a cultural microcosm. Indian spices filled the kitchen, Bollywood music played on weekends, and the scent of incense mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. James learned to cook dal and roti, while Priya mastered hamburgers and Thanksgiving turkey. The first years of their marriage were marked by a rare harmony. They complemented each other perfectly. His analytical approach balanced her intuitive nature, and her cultural diversity enriched his more pragmatic worldview. Friends noticed how they interacted in company, communicating with glances and complimenting each other in conversation. James even began to use basic Hindi phrases, while Priya learned to appreciate American sports. But there were moments when cultural differences led to tension. Priya missed her family intensely, especially during important Hindu festivals such as Diwali or Holi. James tried to understand, but couldn't fully grasp the emotional significance of these traditions. Phone calls with her family in Mumbai became long, tearful affairs that often left her feeling melancholic. She often spoke of returning to India one day, at least for extended visits. Rajesh Sharma visited them twice a year in Austin. These visits were highlights for Priya, but increasingly uncomfortable for James. Rajesh was a man in his 50s who exuded wealth and influence. He wore tailored suits, drove expensive cars, and spoke with the authority of a man accustomed to being respected. During his stays, he subtly took control of household matters, criticized James's understanding of Indian culture, and made it clear that he considered Priya's well-being his personal responsibility. James noticed how Priya's behavior changed during Rajesh's visits. She became more formal, spoke mainly Hindi, and seemed to be playing a role she did not otherwise assume. When James left the room, their conversations often stopped abruptly. Rajesh always brought generous gifts, jewelry for Priya, expensive bottles of whiskey for James. But these gestures seemed more like symbols of power than acts of kindness. In the 3rd year of their marriage, the problems began. Priya became increasingly restless and expressed a growing desire to visit her sick mother in Mumbai. She spoke of stays lasting several months, which James was unable to accompany her on, due to his workload. Their conversations became more tense, fraught with unspoken accusations and growing alienation. James sensed that something fundamental in their relationship was breaking down, but he couldn't identify exactly what was happening. The turning point came in the fall of 2015. Priya received a call from Mumbai. Her mother was seriously ill and urgently needed medical care that was only available in specialized clinics. Without hesitation, she booked a flight for the following week. James offered to come with her, but she declined, explaining that he shouldn't jeopardize his career and that she might have to stay for months. The goodbye at the airport was heartbreaking. They hugged for a long time, and Priya cried as if she was seeing him for the last time. For the first few weeks, they kept in daily contact via Skype and WhatsApp. Priya reported on her mother's condition, the complicated treatment, and the emotional strain on the family. But gradually, their conversations became less frequent and shorter. She explained that this was due to the time difference, the poor internet connection at the hospital, and her exhaustion from caring for her mother. James understood and did not press her, although her growing distance worried him. After 2 months, contact broke off completely. James's calls went unanswered. His messages remained unread. Panic seized him. He contacted Rajesh's office in Mumbai, but the secretary said that Mr. Sharma was away on business in Dubai and could not be reached. Desperate, James turned to the American consulate in Mumbai and asked for help in finding his wife. The consulate officials were helpful, but their options were limited. They were able to confirm that Priya had arrived in Mumbai, but beyond that, her trail had gone cold. 3 weeks after losing contact, James received a phone call that would change his life forever. It was a Tuesday in January 2016, shortly after 7 a.m. in Austin. The phone rang with the international dialing code he now knew by heart. His hands trembled as he answered, hoping to finally hear Priya's voice. Instead, a strange male voice answered in broken English. The man introduced himself as Sub-Inspector Krishnan of the Mumbai Police and asked James to sit down before delivering the news. In emotionless official tones, he reported that a woman matching Priya Mitchell's description had been found dead in a burned-out car on the outskirts of Mumbai. The car had fallen off an embankment and caught fire. Identification had been difficult due to severe burns, but personal items, a gold bangle engraved with their wedding date and her American passport, had confirmed her identity. James's world collapsed at that moment. The phone slipped from his hand and he sank to the kitchen floor as the officer continued to speak. The words reached him only in fragments. Accident. No signs of foul play. Body already cremated according to Hindu rites. Ashes handed over to family. When he regained consciousness, the officer had hung up and the dial tone filled the silence of his empty apartment. The next few hours passed like a nightmare. James desperately called the police station in Mumbai, but Sub-Inspector Krishnan was unavailable. Another officer mechanically confirmed the details of the case. File number MBQ16847. Victim, Priya Mitchell, American citizen. Cause of death, burns in car accident. Case closed. When James asked about an autopsy, he was told that it had not been possible due to the condition of the body and that the family had already arranged for cremation. What family? James shouted into the receiver. I'm her husband. Why wasn't I contacted? The official replied with bureaucratic coldness that the next of kin, an uncle named Rajesh Sharma, had taken care of all the necessary formalities. He had been listed as the emergency contact in her documents and had the power of attorney to act in James's absence. James realized with growing horror that Priya must have granted this power of attorney without his knowledge, probably before her departure. In the days that followed, James desperately tried to fly to Mumbai, but the bureaucratic hurdles seemed insurmountable. His visa application was delayed due to incomplete documentation. The American consulate informed him that the case had already been closed and no further investigation was necessary. According to his office, Rajesh Sharma was still away on business and unavailable. James felt trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare in which every door he tried to open remained locked. Finally, after 2 weeks of intense effort, he received a callback from Rajesh. The voice on the other end sounded tired and dejected. Rajesh explained with melancholic resignation that Priya's death had affected him deeply. She had been like a daughter to him. He described the last few weeks. Priya's mother had indeed been seriously ill and Priya had devotedly cared for her. After her mother's death, Priya had fallen into a deep depression. On that fateful evening, she had taken the car to drive alone and collect her thoughts, a habit she had had since her youth. The mountainous road was known for its dangerous curves, especially at night and in the rain. She wasn't the same after her mother's death, Rajesh said in a broken voice. She often talked about how guilty she felt for leaving her mother alone to go to America. I shouldn't have let her drive alone. He went on to explain that the police had found no evidence of suicide, but also no evidence of foul play. It had been a tragic accident caused by a combination of emotional stress, bad weather conditions, and a dangerous road. James listened as his heart ached with pain. The description fit the Priya he knew: emotional, impulsive, with a tendency to take blame for things beyond her control. But something about Rajesh's account didn't feel complete. Why hadn't she told him about her mother's death? Why had she cut off contact instead of seeking his support? These questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. Rajesh said that Priya's ashes had already been scattered in the sacred Ganges River, according to her own wishes, which she had left in a letter. He offered to send James a copy of the letter, but as weeks passed, nothing arrived. James's repeated inquiries were met with excuses about lost mail and technical problems. The funeral took place in Austin, without Priya's body. A surreal memorial service where James stood in front of a photo of his wife and said his goodbyes while his soul refused to accept that she was really gone. Friends and colleagues came to offer their condolences, but their words felt hollow. How could you mourn someone you had never really said goodbye to? In the months following the funeral, James fell into a deep depression. He could no longer live in the apartment that was so full of Priya's presence. Her clothes in the closet, her books on the nightstand, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. He sold the house and moved into a sterile apartment on the other side of town. His work suffered. Friendships broke down under the weight of his grief, and he began to withdraw from everything that reminded him of the life he had lost. But in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep would not come, the doubts returned. Why had the police closed the case so quickly? Why had the bureaucratic hurdles for his trip to Mumbai been so high? Why had Rajesh had powers of attorney that he knew nothing about? These questions became a constant torment, lodged in his mind like a splinter that could not be removed. 2 years passed in this state of emotional numbness. James functioned, but he didn't really live. He went to work, did his job, came home, and spent his evenings in front of the TV without really seeing what was on. Friends occasionally tried to invite him to social events, but he usually declined. The idea of laughing or feeling joy again seemed like a betrayal of Priya's memory. It wasn't until 2018, when his therapist suggested that a change of scenery might help him, that James began to think about a fresh start. A job offer from Seattle, a promotion to senior systems architect at an up-and-coming technology company, seemed like a sign. He accepted the offer and left Texas, hoping that physical distance would bring emotional healing. In Seattle, he slowly returned to a kind of normalcy, even though the wounds of his past never fully healed. Seattle in 2024 had become a place of cautious healing for James Mitchell. The city, with its foggy mornings and the constant murmur of Puget Sound, offered him the emotional distance he needed to slowly start living again. His position as senior systems architect at Northwest Tech Solutions not only provided him with financial stability, but also the structure his life needed. The company specialized in cloud computing solutions for international companies, and James's expertise in complex system integrations had quickly made him an indispensable member of the team. His colleagues knew him as a quiet, reliable man who delivered precise work and never talked about personal problems. Few knew about his past. James had learned to hide his grief, banishing it to a locked part of his heart where it no longer paralyzed him on a daily basis. He had even started occasionally going out for drinks with colleagues after work, or attending company parties. It wasn't a happy life, but it was a functional one. His apartment in Capitol Hill was spartanly furnished. Modern furniture, neutral colors, no personal items that might trigger memories. The only exception was a small shrine on the nightstand, a framed photo of Priya from happier days, surrounded by a white candle and a small statue of Ganesha that she had once given him. Every morning he lit the candle for a moment and spoke quietly to her, a ritual that helped him start the day. The therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Chen had helped James develop tools to cope with his grief. She'd explained to him that complicated grief, especially in cases of unresolved deaths, could take years, and that it was normal to still have questions. Closure isn't a switch you can just flip, she often said. It's a process, and sometimes part of us always remains open to the possibility of answers. In the spring of 2024, James began to think about traveling for the first time since Priya's death. Not to India, as that wound was still too fresh, but somewhere he could create new memories. His colleague Amanda had recommended Vancouver, just 3 hours north of Seattle. "It's like Seattle, but more European," she had joked. "Perfect for someone who wants to dip their toes into international waters without swimming too far." The idea matured over months. James hadn't taken a real vacation since Priya's death, just the occasional long weekend which he usually spent at home. Dr. Chen encouraged him to take the plunge. "Travel can be transformative," she said. "It forces us out of our comfort zones and opens up space for new perspectives." At the end of September, he finally booked a week in Vancouver, with a hotel room in the city center, and no fixed plans. The trip to Vancouver was his first time crossing the border in years. As he handed his passport to the Canadian border official, he felt an unexpected nervousness. The officer, a friendly middle-aged man, routinely asked about the purpose of his visit. "Vacation," James replied, and the word felt foreign in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had used the word vacation without it being accompanied by guilt. Vancouver welcomed him with autumnal beauty. The city was a harmonious blend of urban sophistication and natural splendor. Glittering skyscrapers set against snow-capped mountains and a harbor bustling with sailboats and ferries. James checked into his hotel on Robson Street and spent the first day wandering aimlessly around the city. It was liberating to be nobody, to have no history, to be just one tourist among many. On the second day of his stay, he decided to visit Granville Island, a lively market peninsula famous for its craft shops and public market. The place was buzzing with activity. Street musicians played on every corner, families strolled among the stalls, and the smell of fresh pastries and roasted coffee filled the air. For the first time in years, James felt something like lightness. He sat down on a bench overlooking the water and watched the boats go by. An elderly couple on the bench next to him were chatting in Hindi, and he found himself listening to the familiar sounds. The language brought back a wave of memories. Priya talking to her mother on the phone, the Bollywood movies they had watched together, the way she switched between English and Hindi when she was excited. The third day brought rain, and James sought refuge in the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. He was fascinated by the exhibits on Canada's Indigenous cultures, especially the way different peoples had passed down their stories through generations. There was an exhibition on cultural assimilation and the loss of identity that touched him deeply. He thought of Priya and how she had lived between two worlds, never quite at home in America, but no longer fully rooted in India either. On the fourth day, a bright and sunny October day, James decided to take a harbor tour. The boat was full of tourists, families with children, older couples with cameras, young backpackers taking selfies. James stood at the railing and let the wind caress his face as the Vancouver skyline slowly passed by. For the first time in 8 years, he felt alive, connected to the world around him. When the boat docked at Canada Place, the passengers poured onto the dock. James followed the crowd and decided to stroll through nearby Gastown, Vancouver's historic district with its cobblestone streets and Victorian buildings. The area was bustling with restaurants, boutiques, and galleries. He bought a coffee and sat down on a bench to enjoy the atmosphere. It was there, while drinking his coffee and watching the hustle and bustle of people, that his life was destroyed a second time. A couple came out of a side street and stepped onto the main street laughing. The man was tall and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit with gray temples. Something about his posture, the way he moved, seemed familiar to James. When the man turned around, James recognized him immediately, Rajesh Sharma. But it wasn't Rajesh who shook James's world. It was the woman at his side. She was smaller, wearing an elegant blue dress and dark sunglasses. Her hair was shorter than before and styled differently. But the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the gesture with which she brushed her hair behind her ear, her characteristic gait, all of this was as familiar to James as his own heartbeat. The coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. People turned around, but James didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the woman who was supposed to have died 8 years ago in a burned-out car in Mumbai. Priya, his Priya, alive, laughing, and hand in hand with the man who had arranged her funeral. The world around him blurred into an unreal kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. His heart was pounding so loudly that he was sure others could hear it. He grabbed the back of the bench to keep from falling as his eyes followed the couple slowly moving through the crowd. Priya, because he was absolutely certain it was her, wore a ring on her left hand that sparkled in the sun. Not her wedding ring. Another one. James stood up on shaky legs and followed them at a distance. His mind struggled to process the impossible. Either he had gone completely mad, or the woman whose death he had mourned for 8 years was alive and obviously with his former uncle-in-law. The second possibility seemed impossible, but the alternative that he was hallucinating was no less disturbing. The couple entered a luxurious restaurant on Water Street. James waited a moment, gathered his courage, and followed them inside. The maitre d' led them to a table by the window, and James managed to get a seat at the bar from where he could watch them without being noticed. When Priya took off her sunglasses to look at the menu, the last of his doubts disappeared. It was definitely her, the dark eyes he had seen so often in his dreams, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall that he had kissed 100 times. They talked quietly, and occasionally Rajesh touched her hand across the table, an intimate gesture that spoke of long familiarity. James ordered a whiskey, even though he didn't usually drink during the day, and tried to collect his thoughts. 8 years. For 8 years he had mourned a woman who was obviously not only alive, but leading a new life with the man who had reported her death to him. James spent the next 3 hours in the restaurant watching the couple as he mechanically ordered whiskey after whiskey. His hand shook so badly that he could barely hold the glass, but the alcohol did nothing to numb the shock. Priya and Rajesh ate lunch relaxed, chatting animatedly and behaving like an established couple enjoying their time together. Occasionally, Priya laughed at something Rajesh said, and that familiar laugh cut James like a knife. When they finally got up to leave, James forced himself to remain calm. He had to find out where they lived. He had to learn more before he acted. With the clear mind of a programmer solving a complex problem, he began to document their movements. He followed them at a safe distance through the streets of Vancouver, taking discreet photos with his cell phone and noting times and locations in an app. The couple first went to a boutique where Priya tried on various dresses while Rajesh waited patiently and offered his opinions. James watched through the shop window as she posed in front of the mirror, just like she used to when she was getting dressed for an event. The familiarity of the gesture was heartbreaking. They then visited an art gallery, where they walked hand in hand through the exhibition rooms, quietly discussing the paintings. Around 4 p.m., they got into a silver BMW convertible parked in front of the gallery. James ran to his rental car and followed them through the city. The drive took them to an affluent suburb called West Vancouver, where luxurious houses perched on hillsides offered spectacular views of the Pacific Ocean. The BMW stopped in front of a modern glass house with a perfectly manicured garden and an Italian marble driveway. James parked some distance away and watched as they walked to the front door together. Rajesh opened it with a key. He obviously lived here. Priya walked in as if she were coming home. James noted the address, 1247 Chartwell Drive. In his hotel room, he Googled the address and found out that the house had been purchased 3 years ago for 2.8 million Canadian dollars. According to public records, the owner was a certain Richard Sharma, apparently Rajesh's Canadian name. James spent the night sleepless, looking at the photos on his phone over and over again, trying to comprehend reality. The next morning, he returned to the house and observed it from various positions. Around 10:15 a.m., Rajesh left the house alone in a black Mercedes, apparently to go to work. Priya stayed behind. James waited an hour, then went to the front door and rang the bell. When the door opened, he found himself face to face with Priya. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose bun. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. 8 years had left their mark on him, too. Then her eyes widened in shock and all the color drained from her face. "James?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hello, Priya," he replied with a calmness he didn't feel. "You look pretty alive for a dead woman." She stared at him for a few seconds, then tried to close the door. James braced his foot against it. "We need to talk," he said firmly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "You must be confusing me with someone else." James pulled out his cell phone and showed her one of the photos he had taken the day before. "This is no mistake, Priya. This is you with Rajesh in Gastown yesterday, 8 years after you supposedly burned to death in Mumbai. Her legs gave way and she leaned against the doorframe. James saw the panic in her eyes, the way she gasped for air. It was the same reaction she always had when she was cornered. "Let me in," he said. "Or should I call the police and explain that I found my wife, who was believed to be dead?" Hesitantly, she stepped aside and let him in. The house was breathtaking. High ceilings, modern artwork, expensive furniture. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto the bay and the mountains beyond. It was a life of luxury, a far cry from the modest existence they had led in Austin. She led him into the living room, where they sat down on opposite sofas. They were silent for a long time as James looked at the woman whose death he had mourned for 8 years. She had aged, of course, but she was still beautiful. There were new wrinkles around her eyes, and her hair had gray strands that she no longer dyed. She wore expensive clothes and jewelry that sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Why?" he finally asked. It was the only word he could utter. Priya closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "It wasn't planned," she began in a low voice. "Not the way it happened." "What wasn't planned?" James asked. "Your death, or that I would believe it?" "Rajesh and we had an affair," she said, squeezing the words out like poison. "It started shortly after our wedding. I know how awful that sounds, but he understood me in a way you never could. He knew my culture, my language, my dreams." James felt his stomach clench. "You've been having an affair with my uncle-in-law since the beginning of our marriage?" "Not intentionally," she replied. "It developed slowly. When he visited, we spent time together talking about India, about the family. You were often at work or busy. We felt lonely, both in our own way. So you decided to deceive me and fake your death?" "No!" She jumped up and began pacing the room. "It wasn't like that. When I went to Mumbai because of Mom, I was really confused. I loved you, James, but I also loved Rajesh. I didn't know what to do. And then what happened?" Priya sat down again and buried her face in her hands. "Mom died 3 weeks after I arrived. I was devastated. Rajesh was there for me, comforting me. We spent the night together and I got pregnant." James felt as if the ground had fallen out from under him. "Pregnant? I didn't know what to do," she continued. "I couldn't go back to you pregnant by your uncle-in-law, but I couldn't just disappear either. Rajesh had an idea. There was a woman, a homeless woman who had died in a car accident. No one had identified her. Rajesh had contacts in the police force. He could arrange for her to be identified as me." "You passed off a dead homeless woman as me?" James asked, incredulous. "We thought it would only be temporary," she said. "Rajesh said he would tell you the truth when enough time had passed, but then it just took too long and it became impossible." James stood up and went to the window. His thoughts were racing. 8 years, Priya. I mourned you for 8 years. I gave up my whole life, moved to Seattle, spent years in therapy, and you lived here in luxury. We didn't plan to go to Canada," she said quietly, "but when it became clear that we couldn't return, Rajesh arranged new identities for us. We came here 6 years ago, and the baby?" A painful expression flashed across her face. "I had a miscarriage in the 4th month. It was very difficult. Did you get married?" She nodded silently. 5 years ago, under our new names." James turned to her. "New names? I'm Shreya Sharma now. Rajesh is Richard. We made up a whole new story. And my feelings, my 8 years of hell, did they play any part in your plans?" Priya broke down and cried. "I thought about you every day. Every day it broke my heart. But I didn't know how to undo it. The longer it went on, the more impossible it became." "You could have called me," James said. "You could have told me the truth. And then what?" She replied. "You would have hated me. You would have hated Rajesh. Our families would have been destroyed. And I would have gone to prison for insurance fraud." "Insurance fraud?" Priya froze as she realized what she had just said. "There was a life insurance policy," she whispered. James felt his world shift again. "What life insurance?" "Rajesh had taken out a policy on my life," she said. "He said it was just for security in case something happened to me. I signed the papers without really understanding." "How much was the sum?" $2 million. James sat down heavily on the sofa. Now it all made sense, the luxurious house, the expensive lifestyle, the new identities. "You cashed in on an insurance policy?" "Rajesh said we needed the money for our new start," she explained. "He said the insurance company would never notice. And you went along with it?" "I was pregnant, alone, scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. James stood up again, his thoughts swirling. 8 years of his life had been stolen for money, not for love or passion, but for mere profit. "Where is Rajesh now?" he asked. "At work," she replied. "He owns a real estate company here. He'll be back around 6 p.m. James looked at his watch. It was 2 p.m. "I'll wait here," he said. The 4 hours until Rajesh's return passed agonizingly slowly. James sat in the living room and watched Priya nervously pacing back and forth between the kitchen and the terrace. She had tried several times to persuade him to leave, had offered him money, had begged him to just disappear and pretend he had never seen her. But James remained adamant. 8 years of deception demanded answers, and he would get them. "He'll be angry," Priya warned for the 3rd time. "Rajesh has a quick temper when he feels threatened." "Good," James replied coldly. "Then there are 2 of us." While they waited, Priya revealed more details of her story in fragments. After her supposed funeral, she and Rajesh had initially lived in a remote cottage in the mountains of Maharashtra, far away from Mumbai and everyone they knew. Rajesh had slowly wound up his business and laundered the insurance money through complicated offshore accounts. They lived a secluded life, rarely meeting other people while new identity documents were obtained. "It was like a prison," she confessed. "I couldn't go anywhere or talk to anyone. Rajesh controlled every aspect of my life. He said it was for my own safety, but I felt like a prisoner." It took almost 2 years to obtain Canadian identities. Rajesh had contacts with an international document forgery ring that specialized in wealthy refugees. For $500,000, they got complete backstories, birth certificates, educational, degrees, employment references, even fake family photos and social media profiles dating back years. "How were you able to simply enter Canada?" James asked. "Rajesh invested $1 million in a Canadian startup company that got him an investor visa," she explained. "I came as his wife after we got married in a private ceremony in New Delhi. All the documents were perfectly forged and no one ever suspected anything." Priya shook her head. "Rajesh is very smart. He studied the Canadian immigration system for months, learning all the loopholes. We even trained ourselves to speak with Canadian accents and memorized the stories behind our new identities." James looked around at the luxurious surroundings, the house, the cars, the lifestyle that cost more than $2 million. "Rajesh is a brilliant businessman," Priya admitted. "He took the insurance money and invested it wisely. His real estate company here is very successful. We've become wealthy, at the expense of my life." Priya lowered her gaze. "I think about you every day, James. I followed your company online, watched your career. I was so relieved to see that you were still alive, that you were successful." "Still alive?" James exploded. "I wasn't alive, I was functioning. For 8 years I was a walking dead man because I believed the woman I loved was dead." At 5:30 p.m., they heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Priya froze, her face turning ashen. "He's here," she whispered. James heard the front door open, followed by Rajesh's familiar voice calling out something in Hindi. Priya replied hesitantly, also in Hindi. James didn't understand the words, but the tone was tense. Footsteps approached the living room. When Rajesh reached the door and saw James sitting on the sofa, he froze completely. For a long moment, the 2 men stood facing each other in silence, the husband who had mourned his wife for 8 years, and the uncle-in-law who had staged her death. Rajesh had grown older, more distinguished. His hair was completely gray, his clothes expensive and tailored. He wore a Rolex watch and leather shoes that cost more than James's monthly salary. But in his eyes was the same calculating expression James had noticed before. "James," Rajesh finally said in a voice that sounded surprisingly calm. "This is unexpected." "For me too," James replied, standing up. "Especially since I thought my wife was dead." Rajesh shot Priya a sharp look. She flinched as if he had hit her. "What did you tell him?" he asked her in Hindi. "Let's speak English," James interrupted. "After all, I'm the one who's been cheated on. I think I have a right to understand what you're saying." Rajesh went to the house bar and poured himself a whiskey without offering James or Priya anything. His movements were controlled, but James recognized the tension in his shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," Rajesh said, taking a sip. "No," James agreed. "I should be in a cemetery mourning my dead wife. Instead, I find her alive and married to you. Interesting twist." "The situation is complicated," Rajesh said. "Complicated?" James laughed bitterly. "You faked her death, collected insurance money, and destroyed my life. I'd call that criminal." Rajesh put down his glass and turned to James. For the first time, James saw real danger in the older man's eyes. "Be careful with your accusations, James. You're in my house, in my country. My rules apply here." "Your rules?" James repeated. "You mean the rules about falsifying identities and committing insurance fraud?" "I mean the rules of survival," Rajesh said coldly. "Something you never had to understand in your privileged American world." James felt his anger boiling. "Privileged? You stole 8 years of my life. You made me believe that the woman I loved was dead while you lived here in luxury." "Priya was unhappy with you," Rajesh said in the same emotionless voice. "She didn't belong in your sterile American world. She needed someone who understood her culture, her needs. So you decided to steal her?" "I saved her." James took a step toward Rajesh, but Priya jumped between them. "Please," she pleaded, "don't fight. It won't solve anything." "She's right," Rajesh said, taking a step back. "Violence isn't necessary. You're here. You found us. What do you want?" James stared at him. It was a good question. What did he want? His wife back? That was impossible. She had become a different person. Revenge? Justice? Or just answers? "I want the truth," he said finally. "The whole truth. And then I want you to pay for what you've done." Rajesh laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Pay? We've already paid. Priya could never see her family again. We can never return to India. We live under false names in a foreign country. Isn't that punishment enough?" "Not for me," James said. "You live in a $1 million house, drive expensive cars, and live a life of luxury. I've spent 8 years in hell." "That wasn't our intention," Priya interjected. "We thought—" "You didn't think at all," James exploded. "You only thought of yourselves." Rajesh walked over to a desk in the corner of the room and opened a drawer. James tensed, ready for anything, but Rajesh only pulled out a laptop. "Would you like to see what we paid for?" he asked, opening the computer. "Here are the reports from the private investigators we hired to keep an eye on you. Here are copies of the therapy bills we secretly paid. Dr. Chen, we financed your treatment." James stared at the screen. There were indeed documents, surveillance reports, photos of him leaving his apartment, shopping, at work, and bills. Thousands of dollars in therapy costs that had been paid through a complicated system of anonymous payments. "You had me watched?" he asked, stunned. "We had to make sure you were okay," Priya said quietly. "It was the least we could do." "The least?" James repeated incredulously. "The least would have been to tell me the truth." "And then what?" Rajesh asked sharply. "Do you think you would have been happier knowing that your wife left you for another man? That she was pregnant with my child? That she never really loved you?" The words hit James like blows. "That's not true," he whispered, looking at Priya. She lowered her gaze and said nothing. "I'm sorry, James," Rajesh said in a voice that sounded almost sympathetic. "But it's the truth. Priya and I were a couple long before her death. The marriage to you was a mistake, a cultural misunderstanding." James felt the ground open up beneath his feet. 8 years of pain, grief, therapy, and it was all based on a lie. Not only had the death been faked, but so had the love. "Is that true?" he asked Priya in a broken voice. She slowly raised her head and he saw the answer in her eyes before she spoke. "I was young," she whispered. "I thought I knew what love was, but with Rajesh, it was different. It was real." James slumped down. The physical exhaustion of the last few days, the emotional shock of the discovery, and now this final humiliation pushed him to his limits. Not only had he mourned a dead woman for 8 years, he had mourned a woman who had never really loved him. "What do you want from us?" Rajesh asked again, this time with less hostility. James looked back and forth between the two. The man, who had destroyed his life, and the woman he had loved, but who apparently had never existed, at least not as he knew her. "I want justice," he finally said in a firm voice, "and I'll get it. If you don't go to the police voluntarily and confess, I'll do it for you." Rajesh and Priya exchanged a glance. In that glance, James saw a communication that spoke of years of partnership, of shared secrets and joint decisions. It was the kind of nonverbal understanding he had once believed he had with Priya. "We can't let that happen," Rajesh said slowly. The tension in the room was palpable as Rajesh's words hung in the air. James recognized the threat in his tone and felt the dynamic of the confrontation shift. What had begun as an emotional confrontation was now taking a more dangerous turn. "What do you mean?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Rajesh opened another drawer of his desk and pulled out something that made James's blood run cold. A small but deadly-looking pistol. "I mean that you won't tell anyone about this," he said with icy calm. Priya gasped. "Rajesh, no! That wasn't part of the plan." "There is no plan anymore," he replied without taking his eyes off James. "He ruined everything by coming here." James slowly raised his hands, his mind working feverishly. "You're not going to shoot me," he said, though he wasn't sure. "That would raise too many questions." "Would it?" Rajesh asked. "A depressed American tourist who hallucinates his dead wife and takes his own life? The police would rule it a tragic suicide." "Rajesh, please," Priya pleaded. "He's still my—" "Your what?" Rajesh interrupted sharply. "Your husband? You don't have a husband. You're dead, remember? And I'm your new husband." James watched the exchange and realized that the power dynamics between Priya and Rajesh were not what they initially appeared to be. She was not his equal partner. She was his prisoner, however luxurious her cage might be. "You controlled her all these years," James said suddenly. "This wasn't a mutual plan." "You manipulated her." Rajesh's smile was cold. Priya was always malleable. She needed someone to make decisions for her. "You were too weak, too Western. You spoiled her instead of guiding her." "I loved her," James corrected him. "Love makes you weak," Rajesh replied. "Control makes you strong." James looked at Priya, who was sitting huddled on the sofa, tears in her eyes. "Priya," he said gently, "you don't have to be his prisoner anymore. We can go to the police together." Rajesh laughed bitterly. "She'll never go with you. She's too deeply involved in this. She's just as guilty as I am." "That's not true," James said. "You manipulated her, blackmailed her. No court would sentence her as harshly as you." For a moment, Priya seemed to waver. She looked back and forth between the two men, the one who had once loved her and the one who had controlled her life for 8 years. "Shreya," Rajesh said warningly, emphasizing her new name. "Remember who you are now. Remember what you have to lose." "What does she have to lose?" James asked. "A life in a gilded cage? An existence as the prisoner of a man who sees her only as his property?" "I gave her everything," Rajesh exploded. "Luxury, security, a new identity. Without me, she would be nothing. Without you, she would be free," James countered. The gun in Rajesh's hand trembled slightly, a sign that his control was beginning to crumble. James recognized his chance and took a cautious step forward. "Stop," Rajesh ordered, but James continued moving slowly and deliberately. "You won't shoot," he said with more confidence than he felt. "You're a businessman, not a killer. You solve problems with money and manipulation, not violence." "You don't know me," Rajesh hissed. "I know you better than you think," James replied. "I've watched you undermine my marriage for 3 years. You're calculating, manipulative, but you're not a killer." James was now only 2 meters away from Rajesh. He could see the sweat on the older man's forehead, the uncertainty in his eyes. "Besides," James added as he pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, "I've already recorded a video explaining where I am and who I've met. If anything happens to me, it will be sent to the police automatically." It was a lie, but Rajesh didn't know that. His eyes widened in panic. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice sounded less confident. James held up his phone, which did indeed have a recording app open. He had secretly activated it when he took the device out. "Try it," he said. "See what happens when an American citizen disappears in Vancouver after finding his wife who was believed to be dead." The seconds stretched into hours. Rajesh stared at the phone, then at James, then at Priya. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and he knew it. Suddenly, Priya collapsed. "Enough!" she screamed. "I can't take this anymore." She jumped up and ran to Rajesh. "Give me the gun. This is all my fault." "Shreya, no," Rajesh shouted, but she had already reached his hand and was trying to wrestle the gun away from him. In the ensuing struggle, a shot was fired. The bang was deafening in the enclosed space. All three froze for a moment before realizing that the bullet had harmlessly hit the ceiling. James took advantage of the confusion and threw himself at Rajesh, who had been thrown off balance by Priya's attack. The gun flew across the room and landed under a sofa. The two men wrestled with each other, James's years of frustration and pain giving him a strength he hadn't thought possible. Although Rajesh was older, he was also in good physical condition. But James's anger gave him the advantage. After a few moments, he managed to pin Rajesh to the floor and hold his arms down. "Priya," he gasped, "call the police." But instead of reaching for the phone, Priya stood motionless, her hands covering her face. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this." "You have to," James urged, holding Rajesh down. "This is your chance to be free." "Free?" She laughed bitterly. "I'll never be free. No matter what happens, I'm a fraud, a liar. I stole 8 years of your life." "It wasn't just you," James said. "He manipulated you." "No," Priya said, shaking her head. "I made my own decisions even if they were wrong." Under James, Rajesh began to laugh, a mad, desperate sound. "She'll never choose you," he gasped. "She's too deep in the lie. She's not the woman you knew anymore." James looked up at Priya, who stared back at him with an expression of utter despair. In that moment, he realized that Rajesh was right. The woman he had loved no longer existed. Standing before him was someone else, someone who had been shaped by years of deception and manipulation. "You're right," James said quietly. "She's not the same person anymore." He stood up and let go of Rajesh, who struggled to his feet. "But that doesn't change what you've done. It doesn't change the crimes." James took out his cell phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, he said in a clear, firm voice, "I want to report insurance fraud and false identities. I'm at 1247 Chartwell Drive, West Vancouver." Rajesh took a step toward him, but James raised his hand warningly. "It's over," he said. "It was already over when I saw you yesterday." In the 20 minutes before the police arrived, a surreal calm reigned in the house. Rajesh sat on his expensive sofa, staring into space, while Priya stood at the window, looking out at the bay. James waited by the door, ready for the officer's arrival. "I'm sorry," Priya finally said without turning around. "For everything." "Me too," James replied. "I'm sorry you never had the chance to find out who you really are." When the police arrived, both Rajesh and Priya surrendered without resistance. They were led away in handcuffs while James stayed with the officers to make his statement. The investigation would take months. There were international aspects to clarify, assets to seize, and a complex web of fake identities to unravel. Weeks later, back in Seattle, James sat in Dr. Chen's office and told her the whole story. She listened silently, nodding occasionally as he recounted the events in Vancouver. "How do you feel now?" she asked when he had finished. James thought for a moment. "Empty," he said finally. "But it's a different kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of grief, but the emptiness of a cleansed space, as if someone had wiped away all the old pain and left me with a clean slate to start over." "And do you think you can start over?" "I think I have to," James replied. 8 years of my life are gone, but I still have many years ahead of me. I can choose what to do with them." 6 months later, Rajesh was sentenced to 12 years in prison for insurance fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Priya received 5 years with the possibility of early release after 3 years, as the court recognized mitigating circumstances. James never visited her in prison. He had said everything he needed to say. Instead, he began to build a new life, a real life based on truth rather than the lies that had shaped his past. The woman he had loved had truly died, not in a burning car in Mumbai, but slowly over years of manipulation and deception. But from her ashes, something new had emerged, the opportunity for James to finally live a real life.